My daughter-in-law said my best birthday gift was leaving. Then I gave her a gift she never expected. I was 72 years old, standing in my own kitchen in an apron I'd worn for 30 years, holding a birthday cake I baked myself, when my daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and told the whole family that the best gift she could ask for was watching me walk out the door for good. Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected her. My own son just stared at his plate. And that silence taught me something that day. Some people don't come after you with knives, they come after you with silence, and silence can cut just as deep. But before I tell you what I did next, and trust me, it is not what she expected, I want to ask you something. Hit that like button right now if you believe family is something you earn every day, not something you're owed by blood. Subscribe if you love a good come-uppance story where grace and grit win in the end. And down in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one. And it warms this old woman's heart more than you know. My name is Judy. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I understood what family meant. I raised one son, Brian, on my own after his father passed when Brian was only 9. I worked 2 jobs, days at the school cafeteria, nights cleaning offices downtown, so that boy never went without. I sewed his Halloween costumes at midnight. I sat in the bleachers for every baseball game in the rain. I put him through college on a cafeteria worker's salary and a whole lot of prayer. And when he called me one spring morning, voice shaking with joy, to tell me he'd met a woman named Ashley and that he was going to marry her, I cried tears of pure happiness. I thought, finally my boy gets to have the family I always dreamed of giving him. Ashley was polished, pretty in that magazine cover way, always put together, always smiling for pictures. The first time I met her, she hugged me tight and said, "I've heard so much about you, Judy. I can't wait to be part of this family." I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. The wedding was lovely. I paid for the flowers and half the catering out of my retirement savings because Brian was still finishing up his degree and money was tight. I didn't mind. That's what mothers do. I stood up during the toasts with my hands trembling and told the room that I was gaining a daughter, not losing a son. Ashley cried. She hugged me again. Everyone clapped. For the first year things were fine. Ashley called me every couple of weeks. She'd ask for recipes, my chicken and dumplings, my pound cake, the biscuits my own mother taught me to make on a wood stove back when I was a girl. I taught her everything I knew, happy as could be, feeling like maybe I really had gained a daughter after all. Then Lily was born. My granddaughter came into the world on a Tuesday in October, and I have never loved anything the way I loved that tiny girl the moment I held her. I drove 2 hours to the hospital with a diaper bag I'd packed weeks in advance, homemade baby blankets I'd crocheted myself, sitting in the waiting room until they let me in. Ashley was exhausted, gracious, grateful. She let me hold Lily for hours. She said, "Judy, I don't know what I'd do without you." That's the thing about people who are planning to use you. They tell you exactly what you want to hear, right up until the moment they don't need you to hear it anymore. Over the next 4 years, I became the built-in babysitter. Every doctor's appointment, every date night, every time Ashley wanted a spa day or Brian had a work trip, I was the one who dropped everything. I didn't mind, not really. I loved that little girl more than my own life. I drove 90 minutes each way, sometimes 3-4 times a week. I missed my own doctor's appointments to make sure Lily got to her dance recitals. I spent my Social Security checks on her school clothes because Ashley said money was tight, even though I noticed the new car in the driveway, the vacations to the beach I was never invited on, the designer purse she carried into church every Sunday. I told myself it didn't matter. Family doesn't count pennies. Family gives because it loves. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being family and started being staff. Free staff with no benefits, no thanks, and, as I'd soon learn, no respect at all. The first real crack came 2 years ago on Thanksgiving. I'd cook the entire meal myself like I did every year, driving over at 5 in the morning to get the turkey in the oven at their house because Ashley said her oven was temperamental, but really, I think she just didn't want to cook. I spent 6 hours on my feet, 70 years old, making dressing and greens and a caramel cake from scratch. When it was time to sit down, Ashley's mother arrived. A woman I'll just call the other grandmother, dressed to the nines, carrying a store-bought pie, and Ashley stood up at the table and said, "I just want to thank my mom for making today so special." Nobody thanked me. Not once. I sat there in my apron, hands raw from washing dishes before the meal was even served, and I smiled because that's what you do. You smile and you tell yourself it doesn't matter. And you drive home in the dark and you cry a little in your car in your own driveway where nobody can see you. I told my sister about it. She said, Judy, some people don't value what's given freely. Maybe it's time you stop giving so freely. I brushed it off. I told her Brian needed me. Lily needed me. I couldn't just stop. But things kept sliding. Ashley started correcting the way I dressed Lily, the way I fed her, even the songs I sang to her, in this clipped, patronizing tone like I hadn't raised a child of my own. She'd roll her eyes when I offered advice. She stopped inviting me to Lily's school events, saying it was too much chaos for me to handle, though somehow her own mother managed the chaos just fine. Little by little, I watched myself get erased from my own granddaughter's life, replaced by a woman who used me for free labor and discarded me for photo ops. My son saw some of it. I know he did. But Brian has always been a peacemaker, maybe too much of one, and every time I mentioned it gently he'd say, Mom, please don't make this difficult. Ashley's just stressed. I stopped bringing it up. I told myself I'd rather bite my tongue than lose access to my granddaughter altogether. Then came my 72nd birthday. Brian had told me weeks in advance they were planning a family dinner at their house. Just the four of us plus Ashley's parents. I was thrilled. I bought a new blouse, had my hair done, baked my own birthday cake because nobody had offered to, and drove over with a light heart for the first time in a long while. The evening started pleasant enough. Lily ran to hug me the second I walked in, which nearly undid me right there on the porch. We ate dinner. Ashley's mother made a toast about found family and how blessed they all were. I sat quietly, waiting for someone to acknowledge it was my birthday at all, and eventually Brian did, raising his glass, thanking me for everything I do. Not much, but I took it. Then after dinner, sitting in the living room with coffee and my cake, Ashley's father, a jovial sort of man, turned to Ashley and asked, half-joking, what the best birthday gift she'd ever gotten was, since apparently it had come up in conversation before I arrived. Ashley laughed, this light, careless laugh, and looked right at me and said, honestly, my favorite gift this year would be Judy finally giving us some space. No offense, Judy, but ever since Lily was born, you're just always here. It'd be a gift if you just left us alone for once. The room went quiet. My son, my own son, looked down at his plate and said nothing. Lily, thank God, was in the other room and didn't hear. Ashley's parents exchanged an awkward glance but didn't say a word either. Nobody defended me. Not one person in that room stood up for the woman who'd been driving 3 hours round trip 4 times a week for 4 years, who'd spent thousands of her own retirement dollars, who'd missed her own doctor's appointments and her own friendships and her own life to be there for that family. I sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, my slice of cake untouched in front of me, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. And then very calmly I stood up, thanked them for dinner, said I had a headache, and drove myself home in the dark. I didn't cry that night. I want you to understand that. I was long past crying. What I felt instead was something colder and clearer. A kind of quiet, deliberate resolve I hadn't felt in years. Because Ashley had just told me in front of witnesses, in front of my own son, exactly how she saw me. Not as family. Not as a grandmother who loved her child unconditionally. As an inconvenience. A burden to be managed. Something to be wished away like a bad habit. So I decided to give her exactly what she asked for. The next morning, I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Prescott who had handled my late husband's estate years before and had stayed in touch ever since, mostly through Christmas cards, but I knew she'd remember me. I told her everything, the years of free childcare, the money I'd quietly funneled into that household for groceries and clothes, and even twice, their mortgage when Brian had been between jobs, all of it undocumented, given out of love, never once with an expectation of repayment. I told her about the comment at my birthday dinner. And I told her what I wanted to do now. You see, years ago when my husband passed, I'd set up a modest trust. Not a fortune, but a decent nest egg from decades of frugal living. A paid-off house, some investments, a life insurance policy. The plan had always been for it to pass to Brian, and eventually to Lily. I had never once considered changing that. Family doesn't need conditions, I always thought. But family also doesn't get to treat you like hired help and then discard you at will. I didn't cut Brian and Lily out. I want to be very clear about that, because this isn't a story about revenge for the sake of cruelty. It's a story about drawing a line I should have drawn years earlier. What I did was restructure the trust so that everything meant for Lily's future, her education fund specifically, was placed directly into an account that only I, and eventually Lily herself at 18, could access. Ashley's name, which had somehow been added years ago as a co-signer on a smaller account I'd set up for household help, a joint account I'd been quietly depositing into for years to cover the girls' expenses, was removed entirely. That account closed. The money moved into Lily's protected education trust, untouchable by anyone but her. And the free child care? That ended too. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I called Brian a week later and told him, gently but firmly, that I would still love to see Lily, that I would always be her grandmother, but that I would no longer be available as unpaid, on-demand childcare 4 days a week. If they needed help, we could arrange scheduled visits, planned in advance, treated with the respect any family member deserves. If they wanted more regular care, they were welcome to hire a nanny, the same as anyone else would. Brian was stunned. He asked what had brought this on, and for the first time in years, I told him the truth calmly and without anger. I told him about the birthday comment. I told him how it felt to spend 4 years of my retirement, my health, my own social life, pouring myself into that house, only to be told my absence would be a gift. I told him I loved him more than my own life, and I loved Lily even more than that, but that loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to use you until there's nothing left. He went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Mom, I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I should have said something that night. I'm sorry." That apology meant more to me than any birthday toast ever could have. Ashley predictably did not take it well. She called me 2 days later, furious, accusing me of punishing a child by removing her name from that account, demanding to know why I would do this to family. And I want you to hear exactly what I told her, because I've thought about this conversation many times since, and I stand by every word. I told her that family is not a one-way street. Family is not free labor with no boundaries and no thanks. Family does not sit at a table and tell a 72-year-old woman, in front of her own son and grandchild in the next room, that the best gift she could give is disappearing. I told her that I had given her every ounce of grace I had for 4 years, and that grace had run out the moment she chose to humiliate me instead of simply asking for space like an adult. I told her that Lily's money was safe, protected, and would be there for her education exactly as I'd always intended, but that it would never again be a slush fund for anyone else's convenience. She didn't have much to say after that. Here's what happened in the months that followed, and this is the part that still makes me smile when I think about it. Without free, constant grandmother as nanny service, Ashley and Brian had to actually sit down and budget for real childcare. They hired a lovely young woman 2 days a week at real cost, which apparently was quite the wake-up call for a household that had been treating my labor and my love as a bottomless free resource. Brian, for the first time in years, started calling me just to talk, not to arrange drop-off times, not to ask a favor, but simply to check in on his mother. We started having a standing Sunday dinner, just the 3 of us and Lily, once a month, planned ahead, appreciated, enjoyed rather than expected. And Ashley? She never apologized outright, not in so many words. But I noticed the little things change. She started saying thank you when I did bring a dish to a gathering. She stopped correcting the way I held my own granddaughter. At Lily's 5th birthday party, she stood up and a little stiffly thanked Grandma Judy for everything she does for this family, and while it wasn't the warmest speech I'd ever heard, it was more acknowledgement than I'd gotten in the 4 years prior. I won't pretend the relationship healed completely. Some cracks don't disappear just because you finally stand up for yourself. But something did shift. I stopped being invisible in that house. I stopped being the woman whose absence would be a gift, and I became once again someone whose presence had value, because I had finally shown them and myself that my love came with dignity attached, not a doormat. Lily is 7 now. She still calls me every Sunday evening to tell me about her week, her voice bubbling over with stories about school, and her new puppy and whatever cartoon she's currently obsessed with. She has no idea about that birthday dinner, and she never will, because that's not a burden a child should carry. What she does know is that her grandmother shows up for her, consistently, joyfully, on terms that let me keep showing up for years to come instead of running myself into the ground trying to earn love that should have been freely given in the first place. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, It's this: love without boundaries isn't sacrifice, it's self-erasure. I spent years believing that being needed was the same thing as being valued. It isn't. You can give generously. I still do every single day, but generosity without respect is just exploitation wearing a family photo as a disguise. It took a room full of silence and one careless sentence at my own birthday table to teach me that lesson at 72 years old. Better late than never, I suppose. I'm not angry anymore. I want to be clear about that. I don't tell this story out of bitterness. I tell it because I know there are other grandmothers out there right now, driving hours on end, spending their retirement, missing their own doctor's appointments, quietly aching for a single word of thanks that never comes. If that's you, I want you to hear this from someone who's lived it. You are allowed to set a boundary. You are allowed to protect your peace and your resources and your dignity, even from your own family, especially from your own family. Love them fiercely. But love yourself enough to stop disappearing to make room for people who never even noticed you were there. Thank you all for listening to an old woman ramble a bit tonight. If this story meant something to you, I'd be so grateful if you'd give it a like and subscribe for more. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to set a hard boundary with someone you loved. I read every single comment, and honestly, hearing from all of you is one of the best parts of my week. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and don't ever let anyone convince you that your absence is a gift. You are worth so much more than that.